I'm Ariel McKee, and I am here with Barak and friends as we gather to listen to Five, Barak's new book that is in progress. And Barak has a really cool idea for sharing the book with us, which is releasing the book chapter by chapter and sharing those chapters with some of us close to him, our special treat, and being able to have live responses. So I'll turn things over to Barak for a moment so he can give us a little bit more of a background of how he came up with this idea and what he thinks will happen in this sort of choose your own adventure.
Cool. Thank you for that intro. Um, Coming up with this idea is combination of the reality, the realization over the last few years that even though my career is in data security, my passion is in writing. I had a couple of books released in the last 4 years and discovered how much I just love writing, and therefore I want to do more of it. At the same time, I'm a big sci-fi fantasy nerd. I've always had this concept of wanting to write one or two or 17 such books, with a lot of stuff kind of swirling around the old noodle. And I also love to perform. And as I was writing the book, and I had a few victims that were willing to listen to me read it, I also discovered that I really enjoy doing that too. In fact, perhaps enjoy it more than the writing, which is almost insane. And so, since I am very fortunate to not need to write for a living, I can write for a passion. It's a great position to be in, and we live in this world where there's a lot of cool ways we can do things that we haven't done in the past. Why not do a sort of weird mixed media thing? Why not release a book without publishing it? Just as I'm writing it, read it out loud to the world, and hopefully we're going to expand this to live sessions, and we're going to open this up to the world, and anybody can join and sort of participate in these live readings. And there's a lot of cool things about it, I think. For example, one of the things I do in here is if I screw up, there's kind of, the chapter I just read is the chapter I just read. I can't go back and start fixing it because I just shared it with everybody. But at the same time, folks can say, hey, this really kind of doesn't land. This doesn't work. So I don't know how this is going to work out. I think it's going to be fun. It's going to be new. It's going to be, I think kind of a cool idea. And nobody will ever find it. And it's just going to be me and my friends. And that's going to be fantastic anyway. So that's like basically what I want to do with it.
It's
And
jazz writing. It's
right,
improvisational jazz writing.
in many ways, yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
And so we'll see, right? We'll see how this works. The book's name is Five, and I think the idea was that I'm going to read one chapter every 2 weeks on a schedule. So the next one's going to be Wednesday, February. I think it comes to February 9th at 7:30 p.m. And the goal is to do these in person, but still have everybody who wants to join remotely. And so, say Ariel and perhaps I'm hoping Mara and Jamie and Greg, anybody who can come in person, be there and we can have the conversation. And it's going to be a streamed one. And so, and anybody can log in and participate. And maybe in the future, we're just going to do it in some random places or what have you. If they still stick with me after one or two chapters instead of rolling their eyes and, oh my God, that is a terrible. Just one thing I get to do that typically you don't get to do with a book, right? Unless somebody reads the back of the jacket or the preface that the author included, I can tell you a little bit how about the book. So, it's sorted into acts, and the first act is basically think of it as a big puzzle, right? It's like a huge picture, and all I'm doing is I'm jumping from one place to another, from one time period to another, and I am just shining a light on a moment in time, or an event in time, or on a person in time, or a long time. They're going to feel very disjointed as we go through this for the first nine chapters, if you will, and that's on purpose. I'm hoping that that lands well. We'll see how you all feel about it. But each one of these can be read as its own separate story until they all really are connected later. Alrighty. So without further ado, I will put on my reading glasses because I'm an old man, unlike Greg here, and jump into it. Five, Act One, in which the tapestry is lain in 9 parts. Chapter title: Spark. It had lived there for some time. It had a good enough sense of itself to know that it was formless. It was also genderless. He or she or perhaps they wasn't sure. Not that it was something that occupied its mind, which it couldn't do anyway because, in fact, it didn't have a mind, at least not in the classical sense. Then again, what was sense exactly, and what did it mean for it to be classical? For this time moment, it decided that it would be a they. They sometimes played around with words this way just to feel what it would be like. They certainly had thoughts. These were long thoughts, slow ones, the kind of thoughts that can take much time to think through. Or maybe they were fleeting and their sense of time was warped. They pondered this question several times, perhaps many times. They didn't exactly remember. Memory was definitely a problem. How they ended up being there on the inside of the big shiny rock was also a mystery, but they remembered that something happened. Something big, something important. So important it was the meaning of creation and of life itself, which was odd because they clearly never had a life. At least not in the classical sense. Their memory was certainly fuzzy about it all. They kept feeling guilty for some reason, but the reason was shrouded in darkness. The kind of darkness that only the gods themselves can place inside of a person's mind. Or a thing's mind. Or any mind, really. But they weren't overly bothered by the darkness. It was the guilt that bothered them, and a sense that they might be able to do something about it, but when and how and where were another mystery. A classical one, they amused themselves thinking. They did know some things. They knew, for example, that the rock was pretty on the inside. Might be on the outside, too, they mused to themselves ever so often, even while acknowledging that they couldn't leave and could therefore never see it from that vantage point. The rock will have had, this strange and beautiful color, a sort of yellowish blue that, after all these millennia, they didn't know if it was millennia, but sort of assumed it because millennia was a cool word that they seemed to know for some reason, and that described a very long time indeed, became warm and comforting, an intimately familiar color, so much so that it had become more than a hue. It became something they could taste, feed on, and become satiated and happy. And because there was so much of it around, they were always happy, or at least they thought they were. They weren't sure what not being happy might be, but there was another memory of being sad, and when they thought about it, the feeling was exactly unlike that of being happy, so they assumed it was the opposite feeling. They also remembered having other feelings, the feeling of being in love and of being torn, and even, while they tried to never think about it at all, of being punished. That feeling sucked. But it was in the before times, the times before being in the rock, and they assumed that those were bad times because they ended in such a feeling. Now must be the good times because they were in the rock, and the rock was this color, and it tasted so, so good. They also figured out at some point that the rock was a sort of crystal, and eventually they decided to call the color by the very clever name of crystal color. It made sense. Perhaps even classically so. When the calling came, it did so without warning, and so they weren't ready for it at all. One moment they were sitting there basking in the warmth of the crystal, thinking idle thoughts about places that made no sense, of tall buildings made of metal and liquid stone, of impossibly large towers floating in the skies, of massive lands full of grazing sheep with a coat so soft and so perfect that to lay one's head, were one to have a head, against one of them would mean to instantly fall into the most comfortable and refreshing sleep ever imagined. Even the mere image of those sheep was enough to fall into precisely such a slumber. And then, suddenly, rudely, with no right for it to happen at all, they were awoken by a terrible sound. A sound that nothing could ever make, should never make, a torment so immense that it would instantly crush every soul that would be unfortunate enough to hear it. A sound so obscene that it was impossible. It was the sound of the fabric of the world itself tearing apart. And then the world died, and they died with it. And that's the intro chapter.
Very, very nice. I like it.
The quiet applause gets louder. I like it. I like
Yeah.
it. And there are so many things in there that's like, oh, wait, what did he just say? That then I miss some like the next thing because I'm pondering the strangeness of what you just said. If they had a mind, and then all of a sudden I start thinking, well, how would I picture not having the kind of mind I have? The sound of the fabric of the world tearing apart, starting to imagine what would that sound like, and but that was near the end. But it was I've used that analogy before when I went to a rocket launch at Vandenberg, and it just sounded like it was so loud it just sounded like the air was ripping. And
Yep.
so right away, that's where my mind went, going to watch that rocket launch because it was something I'd never heard before, and it was quite impressive, and it left a mark. So I think that's what a lot of people do especially when they hear a written word, but also when you read it, right away kind of relate it to something that is maybe in your past or in your imagination, but you had a bunch of things in there that aren't relatable yet, which is fantasy, right? That's good fantasy. You're not regurgitating stuff I've heard before.
Satiated on the colors,
I
the
agree.
yellow blue satiating of being filled up with color. It's very synesthesia, which is how I live my life. So talking about relatable objects, that was delightful. And then the color could only be called crystal. And it's like,
Huh.
yeah, because crystal is crystal, and that's exactly what I would call it. So those, I found it really enjoyable, and that it had decided it was a they and not a he or a she, and it didn't really care. I thought was timely and well written for somebody who is not non-binary themselves, but being able to write that felt very natural.
Cool. Thank you. Well, you hit on a really important theme, and one of the reasons the book is called Five. So the book is called Five because there are five protagonists, but there are also five senses. I play with synesthesia a lot in this book, a lot.
Hmm. Interesting.
So I'm glad that it came across so quickly.
It did, for me anyway.
For those illiterate ones of us, will you describe or define synesthesia in these contexts?
Yeah, synesthesia is basically where your senses are mixed. So there's people that can taste sound, right? Or can hear color. I think it's one of the cool things that humans can do, right? Some humans can that have that. We call it a screw up, but I actually think it's like such a cool thing, right? It's one of the unique things that unusual things that we strange animals, hairless monkeys that are on a magic rock floating in space can do, right? And so, and I just, somehow as I'm writing this book, it's very clearly became a thing I wanted to play with. And so I am playing with it. And you'll notice, Ariel, later on as we continue to progress through the book, that I play with it in all sorts of funky ways.
Hmm.
Um,
Very
it's in
cool.
fact, it's again, like I said, it's one of the reasons the book is called Five.
Uh, well,
Rock, thank you so much for doing this and sharing your writing with us. And I am excited for 2 weeks from now when I get to
yeah,
hear the next installment of Five.
And that
yeah.
one we'll hopefully do in person. So thank you so much for being our MC, and thank you everybody for joining. Really, really appreciate